The boring daily life of a medieval plague doctor. The sun hasn't yet risen over the city of Avignon, and already, Thomas can smell it. The smell that never leaves. Sweet and rotten at the same time, clinging to the morning mist like a presence, like something alive. This is the smell of plague. And it is the smell of his work. Thomas is a plague doctor. Though calling him a doctor is generous. He has no formal medical training. No years spent studying at a university. No deep knowledge of Galen or Hippocrates. What he has is a contract with the city council, a distinctive costume, and a willingness to do a job that almost no one else will touch. It's 1630. The plague has returned to southern France, as it does periodically, sweeping through cities and towns, killing indiscriminately. And cities, desperate for someone, anyone, to manage the crisis, hire plague doctors. Men who will go into infected houses, examine the sick, certify the dead, and keep records of who's dying and where. The pay is good. Remarkably good, actually. Thomas earns roughly 4 times what a typical physician makes. The city of Avignon is paying him 2 florins per day, plus a housing stipend, plus a clothing allowance. In a year, if he survives, he'll make more than most craftsmen earn in 5. But there's a reason the pay is so high. The life expectancy for plague doctors is not encouraging. Thomas rises from his bed in the small house the city has provided. It's better than the lodgings he had before taking this position: 2 rooms, a rail bed, a hearth. But it's also isolated. Located at the edge of town, away from the healthy neighborhoods. No one wants a plague doctor living next door. He's been in this position for 3 months now. 3 months of walking through infected streets, entering homes filled with the dying, documenting death after death after death. Some days he wonders if he made the right choice. Most days he's too tired to wonder anything at all. He dresses in his regular clothes first, a simple linen shirt, wool breeches, stockings. The costume comes later. You don't wear the plague doctor outfit unless you're actually working. It's too cumbersome, too hot, too conspicuous. Thomas eats a sparse breakfast. Bread. A bit of cheese. Watered wine. The city provides food as part of his contract, delivered to his door by a boy who leaves it on the step and runs away before Thomas can open the door. No one wants to get too close. Plague doctors were almost always hired on temporary contracts by city councils, not by individual patients. This is important. They weren't entrepreneurial physicians building a practice, they were civic employees, hired to manage a public health crisis. Their job was as much bureaucratic as medical. After eating, Thomas begins the process of donning his costume. This takes time. Everything must be done correctly, in the right order, because this costume is his only protection against the miasma, the corrupted air that everyone believes carries the plague. He starts with a long waxed overcoat that reaches nearly to his ankles. The fabric is heavy canvas, treated with wax and animal fat to make it impermeable. The theory is that the coating prevents the corrupt air from seeping through to his skin. Whether it actually works, well, Thomas is still alive, so perhaps. The coat smells of wax and stale sweat. It never quite dries out between wearings, and in the summer heat, it becomes almost unbearable. But he wears it anyway. Because the alternative is dying of plague. Over the coat goes a leather overcoat, another layer of protection. Then leather gloves, thick and stiff, that make his hands clumsy. Then leather boots that come up past his knees. And then, the mask. The plague doctor's mask is distinctive. Unforgettable. Terrifying to those who see it coming down their street. It's shaped like a bird's head, with a long, curved beak that extends 6 or 7 inches from the face. Glass lenses cover the eye holes, giving the doctor a blank, inhuman stare. The purpose of the beak is specific. Inside it, Thomas packs aromatic substances, dried flowers, herbs, camphor, rose petals, sometimes vinegar-soaked sponges. The idea, based on miasma theory, is that these sweet smells will purify the air before it reaches his nose and lungs, filtering out the corrupt vapors that cause disease. Does it work? Probably not. The plague is actually spread by fleas carried on rats, though no one in 1630 knows this. They won't figure that out for another 200 years. But the beak mask does serve one unintended purpose. It keeps Thomas from touching his face with his potentially contaminated gloves. And that actually might save his life. He settles the mask over his head, adjusting the leather straps, making sure the lenses sit properly over his eyes. The world immediately becomes narrower, his vision limited to what he can see through the small glass circles. His breathing sounds loud in the enclosed space, amplified, echoing slightly. He looks at himself briefly in the small polished metal mirror hanging on the wall. The figure looking back is not quite human. A tall black shape with a bird's head and blank glass eyes. More specter than man. This is intentional, in a way. The costume serves a psychological purpose. It marks the plague doctor as set apart, as someone operating under special authority. It makes him simultaneously frightening and official. People open their doors to this creature, even though they're terrified of it, because it represents the city's response to the crisis. It represents order in the midst of chaos. Thomas picks up the wooden cane that completes his outfit. Plague doctors carried canes for several purposes: to examine patients without touching them directly, to lift blankets and clothing, to point at things, and occasionally, to fend off desperate family members who might try to grab at the doctor, begging for help that he cannot provide. He's ready now. The sun is just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the empty street outside. Most people are still inside, doors and windows shut tight against the morning air, which they believe is especially dangerous. Thomas steps outside and begins walking toward the city center, toward the registrar's office where he must collect today's list of addresses. The list of homes where someone has reported illness. The list of places where he's expected to go. His footsteps echo on the cobblestones. The leather of his coat creaks with each movement. The beak bobs slightly with his gait. He looks like death walking. And in a way, he is. People see him coming and cross to the other side of the street. Some make warning signs. Some simply stare, frozen, as he passes. Children peek from windows, then are quickly pulled back by anxious parents. This is his life now. Isolation. Fear. The endless documentation of dying. Walking through a city that treats him as both savior and pariah. Necessary but unwanted. Essential but untouchable. He's a plague doctor. And this is just another day. Another morning. Another beginning to the slow, careful, desperately boring work of managing death. The registrar's office is ahead. Thomas can see the clerk waiting in the doorway, list in hand, careful to stay inside while Thomas approaches. The day has begun. And somewhere in this city, someone is dying. And Thomas will be the one to document it. This is his job. This is his purpose. This is the boring daily life of a medieval plague doctor. And it will continue until the plague ends, or until he joins the countless dead he's already recorded in his careful, meticulous handwriting. Thomas reaches the registrar's office just as the church bells ring for morning prayers. The clerk, a thin man named Philippe, stands just inside the doorway, holding a piece of parchment at arm's length. He won't come any closer. He never does. "Morning, Doctor," Philippe says, though his tone suggests the title is merely courtesy, not conviction. Thomas nods, the beak of his mask dipping forward. He's learned not to speak too much while wearing the costume. The mask muffles his voice, makes it sound hollow and distant, which only increases people's unease. Philippe reads from the list, keeping his eyes on the parchment rather than on Thomas's masked face. 4 addresses today. The Mercier house on Rue de Teinturias. The entire family is sick. A widow on Rue Saint-Michel, reported by neighbors. The baker Arnaud's shop, his apprentice died in the night, needs certification. And a suspected case in the Jewish quarter, though the family is refusing entry. Thomas listens, committing the addresses to memory. He carries no paper with him while working. It would become contaminated, potentially spreading disease. Instead, he must remember everything, then return to write his reports at the end of each day. The practice of memory work is exhausting. By evening, his mind is full of names, addresses, symptoms observed, times of death. Sometimes he dreams of lists, of addresses scrolling endlessly through his sleep. The Mercier house first, Philippe continues. The city council wants that one prioritized. Mercier was a city councilor himself. They want to know if it's truly plague or something else. Thomas understands what's not being said. The wealthy, the powerful, they hope their illnesses might be something else. Something less shameful. Less fatal. As if the plague respects social status. As if death cares about a man's position on the council. He takes the list from Philippe's outstretched hand, keeping the transaction brief. Then he turns and begins walking toward the Rue de Teinturias, the street of the dyers, where the Mercier family waits. The city is waking up slowly around him. Shutters open cautiously. A few brave souls emerge to empty chamber pots or draw water from the public fountains. But when they see Thomas coming, they retreat. Doors close. Shutters slam shut. The street empties before him like water parting. This is always how it is. The plague doctor walks through a ghost city, a place where the living hide and only the dying remain visible. Plague doctors were often foreigners or outsiders, specifically hired because they had no family ties in the city. Thomas himself came from a small village in Provence, drawn by the promise of money and the lack of prospects elsewhere. The reasoning was practical. A doctor without local connections was less likely to show favoritism, less likely to falsify reports to protect friends or relatives, more likely to maintain the necessary emotional distance. It also meant that if the doctor died, there would be no grieving family in the city to remind people of the cost. Just another body, another loss, quickly replaced by the next desperate man willing to take the contract. Thomas reaches the Mercier house. It's large, 3 stories, with glass windows, a sign of real wealth. But the windows are all shuttered now, and there's a crude red cross painted on the door. The mark of plague. The warning that this house is contaminated. Someone has also left an offering on the doorstep. Bread, wine, and flowers. Perhaps left by neighbors, perhaps by family members who fled before the sickness took hold. These offerings are common, part superstition, part genuine compassion, part guilty conscience for abandoning the afflicted. Thomas raps on the door with his cane. 3 sharp strikes. The official knock that announces the plague doctor's arrival. For a long moment, nothing. Then shuffling footsteps from inside. The door opens a crack, and a woman's face appears. She's perhaps 40, with dark circles under her eyes and a desperate, haunted expression. "You're the doctor?" she asks, even though his costume makes the answer obvious. Thomas nods. "My husband," she says. "And my son. And my daughter. All of them. Please, you have to help them." This is the moment Thomas dreads most. Because he knows what she wants him to say, and he knows he cannot say it. She wants hope. She wants reassurance. She wants him to promise that her family will survive. But plague doctors weren't really doctors in the healing sense. They weren't there to cure anyone. In fact, most plague doctors had little to no medical training. They were hired for their willingness to enter infected houses and perform specific bureaucratic functions, examining patients, certifying deaths, keeping records, enforcing quarantine rules. Some plague doctors did attempt treatments, using the medical knowledge of the time. Bloodletting. Lancing the buboes, the swollen lymph nodes that gave bubonic plague its name. Applying poultices of herbs and animal fat. But these treatments were largely ineffective, and many plague doctors knew it. Their real job was documentation, not healing. Thomas enters the house, and the smell hits him even through his mask's aromatic filter. Sickness. Sweat. Fear. And underneath it all, the beginning of decay. The woman leads him upstairs. The house is dark, all the curtains drawn. Medieval people believed that light and fresh air could spread the plague, so they sealed their houses tight, creating the exact conditions, dark, airless, warm, that allowed fleas and rats to thrive. Trying to protect themselves, they made their situation worse. In a bedroom on the 2nd floor, Thomas finds the family. The husband lies in the large bed, his shirt soaked with sweat, his breathing labored. The son, perhaps 15, is on a pallet on the floor, curled in a ball, moaning softly. The daughter. Thomas can see immediately that the daughter is already dead. She's still, gray, her mouth open in a final gasp. The woman sees him looking and begins to weep silently. Thomas approaches the husband first, using his cane to lift the man's shirt. There, in the armpit and groin, buboes. The characteristic swellings, dark and inflamed. Unmistakable. He checks the son next. Same signs. The fever, the buboes, the rapid decline. This is plague. No doubt. No room for hopeful alternatives. Thomas turns to the woman. His voice, muffled by the mask, sounds gentler than he feels. When did the symptoms begin? 3 days ago. My daughter first. Then my son. Then my husband. I'm waiting for it to take me too. She says this flatly, without emotion. She's already grieving. Already dead herself, in a way, just waiting for her body to catch up. You need to report the death, Thomas says, nodding toward the daughter. the city will send men to collect the body. You understand you cannot leave this house? The quarantine. I understand. She cuts him off. We're to die here. Sealed in. Like rats in a trap. There's anger in her voice now, and Thomas understands it. One of the most controversial aspects of plague management was forced quarantine. When plague was confirmed in a house, the authorities would seal it, literally board up the doors and windows, mark it with a red cross, and forbid anyone from entering or leaving. Food and water would be delivered and left outside, but the occupants were trapped inside with the disease. The theory was that this prevented the plague from spreading. The reality was that it often condemned healthy family members to certain infection, trapped in close quarters with the sick and dying. Many people tried to flee before their houses could be sealed, spreading the plague further. Others bribed guards or broke quarantine, desperate to escape. Thomas has seen it all. Families clawing at boarded windows. People jumping from second-story windows, breaking bones in their desperation to escape. Guards posted outside quarantined houses, listening to the screams from within, unable, or unwilling, to help. I'll note your husband and son in my report, Thomas says. I'm sorry. The woman laughs bitterly. Sorry. Everyone's sorry. But no one helps. No one cures. You just watch us die and write it down. She's not wrong. This is exactly what Thomas does. He's a recorder of death. A bureaucrat of dying. He enters houses, observes suffering, certifies deaths, and moves on to the next address. Day after day. Week after week. He cannot save anyone. He can barely comfort anyone. He simply documents. Your daughter, Thomas says, gesturing with his cane. When did she pass? An hour ago. Maybe 2. I'm not sure anymore. Time feels strange. Thomas makes a mental note. One death, early morning, female, approximately 12 years old. He'll write it all down this evening, in the ledger he keeps in his isolated house. Every death recorded. Every address noted. The city wants statistics. They want to track the plague's progress, to see if it's growing or receding, to know which neighborhoods are most affected. This data collection was actually one of the most important functions of plague doctors. The information they gathered helped cities make decisions about quarantines, about closing markets, about when to flee and when to stay. It was early epidemiology, primitive but crucial. Though Thomas sometimes wonders who reads these reports, who studies these lists of the dead, and whether anything they learn ever actually saves anyone. He backs toward the door, the woman watching him with hollow eyes. Someone will come for the body, he says again. Stay inside. Keep the others comfortable. I'll return tomorrow to check on them. Though check on them is euphemism. What he means is, I'll return tomorrow to see who else has died. To count the new corpses. To update my records. The woman says nothing. She's already turned away, moving to sit beside her dying husband, taking his hand in hers. Thomas leaves, closing the door behind him. Outside, the street is still empty. The morning sun is higher now, warming the air. Birds are singing somewhere. The world continues, indifferent to the tragedy playing out behind these shuttered windows. He stands there for a moment, the beak of his mask turned toward the sun, breathing in the herbs and flowers stuffed inside it. rosemary, lavender, rose petals. They smell like a garden, like life. But underneath, persistent and clinging, the smell of death. 3 more houses to visit today. 3 more families. 3 more entries in his evening's ledger. Thomas begins walking toward the next address. His leather coat creaks. His boots echo on the cobblestones. The blank glass eyes of his mask reflect nothing. Just another day. Just another set of dying strangers. Just the slow, meticulous, desperately boring work of documenting the plague. And tomorrow, he'll do it all again. Thomas walks slowly toward the widow's house on Rue Saint-Michel. There's no hurry. The dead don't complain about waiting, and the dying, well, his presence won't change their fate. He's learned to pace himself. To conserve energy. Because this work, this endless procession through suffering, it exhausts you in ways that have nothing to do with physical labor. The streets are a bit busier now. Market day, or what passes for market day during plague time. A few brave vendors have set up stalls, though their goods are sparse and their customers fewer. Trade continues because it must. People still need bread, still need candles, still need the basic necessities of life, even as death walks among them. Thomas passes a vegetable seller, and the woman immediately picks up her basket and moves it further from him. She doesn't run exactly, but her movements are quick, deliberate. This happens constantly. Plague doctors carried a social stigma that went beyond mere fear of contagion. They were associated with death itself, like living omens. To see one meant plague was near, meant someone on your street was dying. Some cities even required plague doctors to carry a white staff or ring a bell as they walked, warning people of their approach. Avignon doesn't mandate this, but Thomas thinks the costume itself serves the same purpose. No one mistakes him for anything other than what he is. A group of flagellants passes in the opposite direction. 6 men, bare to the waist despite the morning chill, whipping their own backs with knotted cords. Their skin is raw, bleeding in places. They're chanting prayers, begging God for mercy, doing penance for the sins they believe brought the plague upon the city. Flagellant movements were common during plague outbreaks. Groups of religious zealots would travel from town to town, publicly whipping themselves, preaching repentance, claiming that the plague was divine punishment for human wickedness. Some people found them inspiring. Others found them disturbing. The church officially condemned them, but during times of plague, authorities rarely had the resources or will to stop them. Thomas watches them pass. One of the men meets his glass-eyed gaze and holds it for a moment, as if challenging him. As if asking, "What do you offer that we don't? You with your science and your herbs and your records. We offer redemption. We offer meaning to this suffering." Thomas looks away first. He has no answer for them. He reaches the widow's house. It's small, narrow, squeezed between 2 larger buildings. The door hangs slightly ajar, which is unusual. Most people keep their doors firmly shut during plague times. Thomas pushes it open with his cane and calls out, "Plague doctor. I'm entering." No response. He steps inside. The room is dim and cluttered. A single room, really, serving as kitchen, bedroom, and living space all at once. A pallet in the corner. A small table. A cold hearth. The smell of unwashed bodies in chamber pots. And there, on the pallet, the widow. She's elderly, perhaps 70, which is quite old for this time. Her eyes are open, staring at the ceiling. Her mouth is slack. She's been dead for hours, possibly since last night. Thomas approaches and examines her with his cane, lifting her sleeve to check for buboes. He finds them, dark swellings in her armpit, already beginning to putrefy. Plague, definitely. But she died alone, which means she likely collapsed quickly. Some plague victims declined over several days. Others went from healthy to dead in less than 24 hours. This is something Thomas has learned in his 3 months as a plague doctor. Death has no consistent pattern. 2 people can be infected at the same time, with the same strain, and one will die in a day while the other lingers for a week. Young, healthy people sometimes died faster than the elderly or infirm. The plague didn't follow rules. Medieval people didn't understand this, of course. They looked for patterns, for explanations. They blamed the victim's sins, or their constitution, or the alignment of the planets. They needed the deaths to make sense, to have meaning. Random, senseless death was too terrifying to accept. Thomas makes his mental notes. Female, elderly, died alone, buboes present. Address, Rue Saint-Michel, 3rd house from the corner. Time of death, unknown, but rigor mortis suggests at least 6 to 8 hours ago. He should search the room for any identifying documents, for information about next of kin. This is part of his job. But the room is so sparse, it's clear the widow had almost nothing. No papers. No valuable possessions. Just the worn clothes on her body and a few clay pots in the corner. Many of the plague dead were like this. Poor. Alone. Living in conditions that made them more vulnerable to disease, cramped spaces, poor nutrition, exposure to rats and fleas. The plague killed people of all classes, but it killed the poor in far greater numbers. Yet another pattern Thomas has observed but cannot explain. He backs out of the room and closes the door. Later today, the city's corpse collectors will come. They work at night, usually, because the sight of carts full of bodies being wheeled through the streets causes panic. Better to do it in darkness, when most people are shuttered inside. The corpse collectors were almost always criminals or desperately poor men, offered reduced sentences or substantial pay to do this nightmarish work. They would stack bodies in carts, haul them to mass graves outside the city walls, and dump them in. No individual burials. No funeral rites. Just bodies piled on bodies, lime scattered over them to speed decomposition and mask the smell. Thomas has never watched the corpse collectors at work. He's glad of that. There are some aspects of this crisis that he doesn't need to witness. 2 addresses down. 2 more to go. He walks toward the baker's shop. Arnaud the baker, Philippe had said. The apprentice died in the night. Needs certification. The baker's shop is in a better neighborhood, on a wider street near the central marketplace. When Thomas arrives, he finds Arnaud waiting outside, pacing nervously. The baker is a stout man, flour still dusting his forearms, though no bread is baking today. The ovens are cold. Doctor, Arnaud says, relief and fear mixing in his voice. Thank God. The boy is inside. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just leave him there. But I can't have a body in my shop. People won't buy bread from a shop where... He trails off, unable to finish the sentence. Thomas understands. commerce during plague time required careful management of perception. If word spread that someone died in your shop, in your home, customers would avoid you, even after the plague passed. Your livelihood could be destroyed by association with death. "Show me," Thomas says simply. Arnaud leads him inside. The shop is clean, well-maintained, with empty shelves where bread would normally be displayed. They go through a door to the back, to the small room where the apprentice slept. The boy is young. 14, maybe 15. He lies on his straw mattress, his face peaceful, almost as if he's sleeping. But his skin has the grayish pallor of death, and when Thomas examines him, he finds the telltale buboes. "When did he fall ill?" Thomas asks. "Yesterday afternoon. Said he felt feverish, had a headache. I thought maybe he'd just worked too hard. He was a good boy, always working hard." Arnaud's voice cracks slightly. "By evening he was burning up. I gave him water, made him comfortable. By midnight he was gone. Fast. Remarkably fast." Thomas has seen this before. Sometimes the plague struck like lightning, killing within hours. Other times it was a slow torture, lasting days or even weeks. "Did you touch him?" Thomas asks. "After he died?" Arnaud shakes his head vigorously. "No. I remembered what they told us. Don't touch the dead. Don't handle the bodies. I covered him with a blanket and left the room." This was sound advice, though based on incorrect reasoning. Medieval people believed that corpses emanated especially potent miasma, concentrated corrupt air. So they were warned not to touch the dead, not to breathe near them. In reality, dead bodies weren't particularly contagious. The danger came from the fleas that might still be on them, jumping to new hosts. But the end result was the same. Avoiding contact with corpses probably did reduce transmission, even if people didn't understand why. "You did right," Thomas says. "I'll certify the death. The collectors will come for him tonight. You should close the shop for at least a week. Fumigate the premises." "A week?" Arnaud's face falls. "But I need to work. I have rent to pay, supplies to buy. A week with no income." Thomas says nothing. What can he say? The economic devastation of the plague was almost as terrible as the death toll. Businesses closed. Trade routes collapsed. Entire professions disappeared when too many practitioners died. People who survived the plague often found themselves destitute, their livelihoods destroyed. Some plague doctors were empowered to enforce business closures, to quarantine not just houses but entire streets or districts. It was necessary to control the spread, but it also generated enormous resentment. People saw the plague doctor not as a helper but as an agent of destruction, bringing not just bad news but economic ruin. "I'm sorry," Thomas says, and he means it. "But if you stay open and someone else gets sick, if it spreads from your shop, the authorities will burn it down. Do you understand? They'll burn your shop to the ground to stop the contagion." This was not an exaggeration. In extreme cases, authorities did order infected buildings burned. It was rare, because fire could spread, but the threat was real enough to terrify people into compliance. Arnaud's shoulders slump in defeat. "A week then." "I'll close for a week." Thomas nods. He makes his mental notes. Male, adolescent, rapid onset, death within 12 hours. Baker's apprentice. Address noted. As he turns to leave, Arno calls out. Doctor? Will it spread? Will more of us get sick? Thomas pauses. It's a question he hears constantly. And he never knows how to answer truthfully without either lying or causing panic. Perhaps, he says finally. Watch for fever. Watch for swelling. If you feel ill, report it immediately. Don't wait. It's not comfort, but it's honest. He leaves the shop, stepping back into the street. The sun is higher now, nearly midday. His leather coat is becoming uncomfortably warm. Sweat trickles down his back, soaking into his linen shirt underneath. The mask makes breathing difficult, each inhalation requiring effort. One more address. The Jewish Quarter. A suspected case where the family is refusing entry. Thomas sighs, the sound muffled inside his mask. This will be complicated. It always is in the Jewish Quarter. During plague outbreaks, Jewish communities often suffer doubly. First from the plague itself, like everyone else. But also from persecution, from accusations that they had caused the plague by poisoning wells or conspiring with the devil. Pogroms were common during plague years. Entire Jewish communities murdered by mobs who needed someone to blame. In Avignon, the authorities had so far prevented large-scale violence, but the tension was always there. And Jewish families had learned, over generations, to be wary of Christian officials entering their homes. Even officials who claimed to be there to help. Thomas walks toward the Jewish Quarter, dreading what he'll find there. Knowing that his bird mask and black robes will be even more frightening in a community that has every reason to fear what official visitors might bring. The afternoon stretches ahead of him. More houses. More dying. More notes to commit to memory for tonight's ledger. This is the work. This is the life. Day after day. Week after week. The boring, terrible, necessary work of documenting death. The Jewish Quarter sits in the eastern part of the city, near the old walls. The streets here are narrower, the buildings older, leaning toward each other as if sharing secrets. Thomas has been here before, during other plague years, other outbreaks. The reception is never warm. As he enters the quarter, he notices the immediate change. People don't just avoid him here, they watch him. From doorways, from windows, from the shadows between buildings. Silent. Assessing. Calculating the threat he represents. A group of men blocks the street ahead. Not aggressively, but deliberately. Thomas stops, waiting. This is their territory, and he's learned that pushing forward uninvited only makes things worse. An older man steps forward. He has a gray beard and intelligent eyes that assess Thomas carefully, taking in every detail of his costume. "You're the plague doctor," the man says. It's not a question. Thomas nods once. "We don't want you here." "I understand. But the city has reported a case. I'm required to investigate." The man's jaw tightens. Required. Always required. The Christian authorities are always required to enter our homes, to search our belongings, to count our dead. There's history in his voice. Decades, centuries of history. Of officials using plague as an excuse for persecution. Of houses searched for imaginary evidence of well poisoning. Of families dragged from their homes and executed based on rumors and hysteria. Thomas chooses his words carefully. I'm not here to search anything. Only to confirm illness and certify deaths. The city requires records. That's all. Records, the man repeats, tasting the word like something bitter. And when these records show that Jewish families are sick, what happens then? Do the good Christians of Avignon decide we've brought God's punishment upon the city? Do they come with torches? It's happened before. Thomas knows it. The man knows he knows it. In 1348, during the worst of the Black Death, Jewish communities across Europe were massacred. In Strasbourg, 2,000 Jews were burned alive in a single day, accused of causing the plague. In Basel, they were locked in a wooden building and burned. In dozens of cities, hundreds of towns, the same story. And yet, paradoxically, Jewish communities sometimes had lower death rates during plague outbreaks. Not because of any immunity, but because Jewish religious law mandated practices that accidentally reduced transmission. Ritual hand-washing before meals. Burying the dead quickly. Keeping houses clean. Avoiding contact with the sick. These practices, done for religious rather than medical reasons, actually helped. But lower death rates only made Christians more suspicious. If Jews weren't dying as much, it must mean they caused it. This was the twisted logic of plague-time persecution. I'm not here to persecute anyone, Thomas says quietly. I'm here to do my job. To keep records. To help the city understand where the plague is spreading. Nothing more. The old man studies him for a long moment. Then he sighs. The Levi family. Fourth house on the left. The father is sick. The mother asked a neighbor to report it because she hoped if she followed the rules, if she was honest, it would be different this time. There's sadness in his voice. The sadness of someone who's learned, over and over, that following the rules doesn't always protect you. Will you let me pass? Thomas asks. The men blocking the street look to the older man. He nods, and they step aside, but they don't leave. They follow at a distance, watching. Making sure Thomas goes only where he's supposed to go. Making sure he doesn't search other houses, doesn't pry into things that aren't his business. Thomas understands. They're protecting their community the only way they can. He reaches the fourth house. It's small but well-maintained, with a mezuzah on the doorpost. He knocks with his cane. 3 times. The official knock. The door opens almost immediately. A woman stands there, young, perhaps 30, with red-rimmed eyes. She's been crying but has stopped now, composed through sheer force of will. You came, she says, and there's surprise in her voice. I was sent to examine your husband. She nods and steps aside, letting him enter. The house is simple but clean. Cleaner than many Christian homes Thomas has visited. A table, some benches, a hearth with a small fire burning. Kosher dietary laws meant Jewish families kept their kitchens carefully organized, utensils separated, everything maintained according to religious requirements. He's upstairs, the woman says. It started 2 days ago. Fever first. Then the swellings. I know what it is. Everyone knows what it is. She leads him up a narrow staircase to a small bedroom. A man lies on the bed, perhaps 35, his face flushed with fever, his breathing labored. When Thomas examines him with his cane, lifting the man's shirt, he sees the buboes immediately. In the groin, in the armpit. Angry, swollen, dark. Plague. Unmistakable. The man's eyes flutter open. He sees the bird mask hovering over him and flinches. Angel of death, he murmurs in fevered delirium. No, his wife says quickly, taking his hand. Just a doctor. Just a man. But Thomas wonders if the fevered man isn't, in some way, correct. What is he, really, but a harbinger of death? A recorder of dying? He heals no one. He saves no one. He simply bears witness. How many others in the household? Thomas asks. Just us. We have no children. There's old grief in her voice when she says this. Childlessness was considered a curse, a sign of God's disfavor. Though right now, Thomas thinks, it might be a blessing. No children to watch their father die. No children to fall sick themselves. You'll need to quarantine, Thomas says. Stay inside. I'll report this, and the city will. Seal our door, the woman finishes. Yes. I know. Like everyone else. Trapped inside to die together or survive together. Plague quarantine rules were supposed to apply equally to everyone, regardless of religion or social class. In practice, enforcement was often inconsistent. Wealthy families could sometimes bribe their way out of quarantine. Poor families might be sealed in and then forgotten, left to starve even if they survived the plague. And Jewish families. Jewish families were sometimes quarantined more strictly, their houses watched more carefully, their movements restricted even after the danger had passed. I'm sorry, Thomas says, and again he means it. The woman looks at him, really looks at him, as if trying to see the person behind the mask. Are you? Do Christian doctors feel sorry for Jewish suffering? It's a fair question. Thomas has no good answer. I feel sorry for all suffering, he says finally. Plague doesn't care about religion. Death doesn't distinguish between Christian and Jew. No, the woman agrees. But the living do. The living always do. She's right, of course. Plague killed indiscriminately, but the aftermath, the blame, the persecution, the scapegoating, that was entirely human creation. Thomas makes his mental notes. Male, mid-30s, fever and buboes, 2 days progression. Jewish quarter, Levi family. Wife still healthy, but exposed. As he turns to leave, the woman speaks again. Will you come back? Tomorrow? To check on him? Yes, Thomas says. I'll return tomorrow. And if he dies? Will you certify it? Will you make sure he gets a proper burial? This is complicated. Jewish law requires burial within 24 hours, requires specific rituals, requires burial in consecrated Jewish ground. But plague regulations often overrode religious requirements. Bodies had to be disposed of quickly, and mass graves didn't distinguish between faiths. Many Jewish communities tried to maintain their own burial practices during plague times, but it was difficult. Authorities often forbade it, worried about contagion or simply unwilling to make exceptions. I'll do what I can, Thomas says, which is honest if not reassuring. The woman nods. She expects nothing more. Thomas leaves the house. The men are still outside, still watching. The older man approaches him again. Well? It's plague. They'll need to quarantine. I'll report it to the registrar. And then what? Will the city send guards to seal their door? Will they send men to watch the house, to make sure no one escapes? Or will they just let the house burn with them inside if things get bad? Thomas doesn't answer because he doesn't know. He's seen all of these outcomes. The plague brings out both the best and worst in people. Acts of tremendous compassion alongside acts of cruelty. Sometimes from the same people, on the same day. "I'll return tomorrow," Thomas says. "To check on them." The old man nods. "See that you do." We remember who keeps their word. And who doesn't. It's both a request and a warning. Thomas walks back through the Jewish quarter, feeling the weight of watching eyes. The bird mask that makes him frightening to Christians makes him something different here. A representative of Christian authority. A potential threat. Even if he personally means no harm, he's part of a system that has caused tremendous harm. He's grateful when he reaches the main streets again, back in the Christian quarter where people simply fear him rather than fear what he represents. The sun is past its zenith now, beginning its slow descent toward evening. Thomas's work day is mostly finished. 4 addresses visited. 4 reports to write this evening. 1 death to certify, 3 cases of active illness to document. But before he can return home, he has one more obligation. He must report to the registrar's office, must give Philippe a verbal summary that will be passed on to the city council. This is done daily, keeping the authorities informed of the plague's progress. Thomas walks back toward the city center. His feet ache. His back aches. The leather coat is stifling in the afternoon heat. The mask feels heavier with each passing hour, the straps cutting into his scalp. Plague doctors often worked only a few hours per day, not because the job was easy but because the protective costume made longer work impossible. The heavy layers, the restricted vision, the difficulty breathing through the aromatic filters, it was physically exhausting even when you weren't also dealing with the emotional toll of constant exposure to death. Some plague doctors lasted only weeks before quitting, unable to continue. Others died of plague themselves. The average tenure was perhaps 6 months before death, exhaustion, or resignation. Thomas has been doing this for 3 months. 3 months of walking through dying city. 3 months of the bird mask and the leather coat and the endless documentation. How much longer can he continue? How much longer will his luck hold? These are questions he tries not to ask himself. Because once you start questioning whether you'll survive, whether this is worth it, whether anything you're doing actually matters, once you start down that path, it's hard to keep going. So he doesn't think about it. He just does the work. 1 day at a time. 1 address at a time. 1 death at a time. He reaches the registrar's office. Philippe is waiting, as always, careful to maintain his distance. "Report," Philippe says, pen already poised over parchment. And Thomas begins to recite. Names, addresses, symptoms, deaths. The boring, mechanical details of the day's tragedy. Just another day in the life of a plague doctor. Just another collection of facts to be recorded and filed and eventually, perhaps, forgotten. The work continues. The plague continues. And Thomas continues, trapped inside his bird mask, neither fully alive nor quite ready to die. Thomas finishes his report to Philippe and turns toward home. The walk back to his isolated house at the edge of town feels longer every day. Or perhaps he's just more tired. It's hard to tell anymore where physical exhaustion ends and spiritual weariness begins. The streets are quieter now in the late afternoon. Most people are inside, preparing evening meals, settling in before darkness falls. No one wants to be out after dark during plague time. The night belongs to the corpse collectors, to the sounds of cartwheels on cobblestones, to things better left unseen. As Thomas walks, he passes a church. St. Pierre, one of the smaller parish churches. The door is open, and he can hear singing from inside. A funeral mass, perhaps, though funerals are complicated during plague time. The church's position on plague was complex and sometimes contradictory. On one hand, clergy were expected to minister to the sick and dying, to provide last rites, to offer spiritual comfort. On the other hand, many priests fled plague-stricken cities, abandoning their congregations to save themselves. Those who stayed often died in large numbers, creating a shortage of clergy that left many plague victims to die without the sacraments they believed were necessary for salvation. Some bishops hired plague priests. Clergy specifically contracted to minister to plague victims, much like plague doctors were contracted to examine them. These priests were often poorly trained, sometimes not even properly ordained. They were men desperate enough to risk death for steady pay, performing religious duties they barely understood. Thomas has encountered several plague priests in his work. Some were genuinely pious, accepting their likely death as God's will. Others were clearly terrified, rushing through rites, touching as little as possible, fleeing houses the moment their duty was fulfilled. He wonders sometimes if the plague priests look at him and think, at least that man has a mask, has protective clothing. We have nothing but faith in a prayer book. Thomas continues past the church. He's not particularly religious, though he doesn't say this aloud. In 1630, admitting to doubt or disbelief could be dangerous. But after 3 months of watching the pious die alongside the sinful, of seeing children taken and criminals spared, of witnessing the random, meaningless distribution of death, it's hard to maintain faith in divine justice. He reaches his house just as the sun touches the horizon. The isolation that seemed burdensome when he first moved in now feels like relief. No one watches him here. No one crosses themselves when he passes. He can simply be Thomas, not the bird-masked harbinger of death. He enters through the small wooden door and immediately begins the process of removing his costume. This must be done carefully, methodically. The coat and gloves and mask are all potentially contaminated. If he touches his face, his mouth, his eyes with contaminated hands, he could infect himself. First, the gloves. He peels them off slowly, turning them inside out as he removes them, ensuring the outer surface doesn't touch his skin. Then the outer leather coat, shrugged off carefully and hung on a peg near the door. The waxed canvas coat beneath comes next, equally careful. Then, finally, the mask. Thomas removes it and sets it on a shelf specifically designated for this purpose. The beak stares back at him, empty now, just leather and glass and metal wire. Without a person inside, it looks almost ridiculous. A theater prop. A carnival costume. But he knows what it becomes when worn. How it transforms him into something other than human. Something feared and necessary and utterly alone. He washes his hands and face in a basin of water mixed with vinegar. Vinegar was believed to have cleansing properties, to purify away contamination. Whether it actually helped was unclear, but the ritual of washing felt important. A transition between the work world and the private world. Between the plague doctor and the man. Medieval plague doctors had various theories about how to avoid infection themselves. Beyond the costume, some drank vinegar or wine mixed with herbs. Some chewed garlic constantly. Some carried amulets or relics. Some prayed. Some simply accepted that death was likely and made peace with it. The survival rate for plague doctors was difficult to calculate, but estimates suggest that roughly half died within the first year of service. Some contracted plague directly from patients. Others succumbed to other diseases. Their weakened constitution and constant stress made them vulnerable to everything from pneumonia to typhus. Thomas has been lucky so far. Or careful. Or both. But he knows his luck won't last forever. Statistically, probability, eventually, the plague will find him. He tries not to think about it. Instead, he focuses on the evening's work. The reports. The documentation that justifies his salary and his purpose. Thomas sits at his small wooden table and opens his ledger. It's a large book, bound in leather, with thick pages covered in his careful handwriting. Names and dates and addresses. Symptoms and progression. Deaths certified. Cases observed. This ledger is one of several he's filled since taking this position. The city stores them all, archiving the records of the plague for, what? Posterity? Study? Evidence for some future understanding of disease? The practice of keeping detailed medical records during plague outbreaks was actually quite advanced for its time. Most medieval medicine was based on tradition and theory rather than observation. But plague doctors, by necessity, became empiricists. They observed patterns, noted symptoms, tracked progression. Their records formed a kind of proto-epidemiology, even if they didn't understand the mechanisms they were documenting. Some of these records would actually prove valuable centuries later, helping historians understand the spread and impact of historical plague outbreaks. But Thomas doesn't know this. He simply writes because it's required, because the city pays him to document what he sees. Today's entries. Mercier household, Rue de Teinchurias. Husband Pierre, wife Anne, son Jacques, daughter Marguerite. Daughter deceased this morning, approximately 2 hours before examination. Son and husband presenting with fever and buboes, advanced stage. Wife shows no symptoms yet but certainly exposed. Recommended quarantine. Expected outcome, 3 more deaths within 5 days. Widow Bertrand, Rue Saint-Michel. Found deceased, alone. Buboes present. Time of death estimated 6 to 8 hours before discovery. No known relations. Body to be collected. Arnaud, baker, Rue du Marquet. Apprentice Jean deceased overnight. Rapid progression, less than 12 hours from first symptoms to death. Recommended shop closure for fumigation. Owner not yet symptomatic. Levi household, Jewish quarter. Husband Abraham presenting with fever and buboes, 2 days progression. Wife Rachel exposed but not yet symptomatic. Quarantine ordered. Special note, community tension present, recommend careful handling. He writes in Latin, as required by the city. Most official documentation was kept in Latin, the language of education and authority. This had the additional benefit of making the records less accessible to common people, who might panic if they could easily read the full accounting of deaths in their neighborhoods. The act of writing is meditative. The scratch of pen on paper. The smell of ink. The formation of letters into words, words into records, records into history. For these moments, Thomas is not walking through infected houses. He's not confronting grief and terror. He's simply writing. When the day's entries are complete, he closes the ledger and sets it aside. His hand cramps slightly. He's been gripping the pen too tightly, as he often does. The room is darker now. Evening has arrived. Thomas lights a candle, just one, because candles cost money and he's learned to be frugal. The flame flickers, casting shadows on the walls. He prepares his evening meal. It's simple. Bread, hard cheese, some dried figs, a cup of wine, barely watered. The city provides food as part of his contract, but it's basic fare. No one expects plague doctors to dine well. He eats alone, as he always does. Plague doctors were often socially isolated, even when not physically quarantined. People didn't invite you to dinner when your day was spent among the dying. You didn't have friends who wanted to visit your potentially contaminated house. You existed in a strange liminal space, part of the community but separate from it, essential but unwanted. Some plague doctors dealt with this isolation better than others. Thomas had heard of plague doctors in other cities who drank heavily, or visited brothels, though what kind of prostitute would accept such a client was unclear, or simply spiraled into despair. Thomas himself has found a kind of peace in the isolation. Or perhaps resignation. He's not sure there's a difference anymore. After eating, he sits by the window, looking out at the darkening city. From here, he can see the walls, the roof lines, the church towers silhouetted against the purpling sky. Somewhere out there, people are dying. The Mercier family. Perhaps the Baker Arnaud's neighbors. Abraham Levi in the Jewish quarter. Tomorrow, Thomas will visit them again. Will note their decline or recovery. Will certify new deaths if necessary. Will add more names to his ledger. And the day after that, he'll do it again. This is the rhythm of his life now. Morning preparation, donning the costume, walking the streets, entering infected houses, examining the sick, documenting the dying. Then home, washing, writing, eating, sleeping. And again. And again. Some plague outbreaks lasted months. Some lasted years. The Great Plague of 1348 raged for nearly 5 years before finally receding. This current outbreak in Avignon has been active for 7 months. No one knows when it will end. It simply continues until it doesn't, until the last case recovers or dies, until the disease burns through all available victims and has nowhere left to spread. Thomas could leave. His contract allows for termination with 30 days' notice. He could collect what pay he's owed, leave Avignon, find some other work in some other place. Many plague doctors did exactly this, moving from city to city, outbreak to outbreak, always staying just ahead of their own probable infection. But where would he go? What would he do? He's 32 years old, with no trade beyond this morbid specialty. No family waiting for him elsewhere. No particular place calling him home. So he stays. Because staying is easier than leaving. Because the money is good. Because someone has to do this work, and it might as well be him. He finishes his wine and stands, feeling the day's exhaustion settle into his bones. His back aches where the leather straps of the costume dig in. His feet are sore from walking. His eyes burn from the strain of peering through the mask's narrow lenses all day. Thomas prepares for bed. He washes once more, carefully, methodically. Then he lies down on his simple mattress, pulling a thin blanket over himself. Outside, he can hear the distant sound of cartwheels. The corpse collectors, making their rounds. He wonders if they're collecting the widow's body tonight. Or perhaps the baker's apprentice. Or other bodies he hasn't seen yet, deaths that happened after his rounds were complete. The work continues, even while he sleeps. The plague never rests. Death never takes a night off. Thomas closes his eyes. Tomorrow, the rooster will crow at a nearby farm. The sun will rise. He'll wake, eat his pulse, no, his bread. Wrong century. He'll eat his bread, don his costume, and begin again. The boring daily life of a medieval plague doctor. Repetitive. Exhausting. Necessary. And somehow, despite everything, he continues. One day at a time. One address at a time. One death at a time. Because this is who he is now. This is what he does. He is Thomas. He is the plague doctor. He is the man in the bird mask who walks through dying streets and writes down names in a ledger that no one will ever read. Morning arrives with the sound of church bells. Not the joyful pealing of a celebration, but the steady, somber tolling that marks another funeral. Thomas lies in bed for a moment, counting the bells. 15 strokes. Someone of moderate importance, then. The wealthy get more bells. The poor get fewer. Even in death, status matters. He rises slowly, his body protesting. There's a new ache in his left knee that wasn't there yesterday. Small injuries and pains accumulate when you spend your days walking miles through city streets, climbing stairs, bending to examine patients. Plague doctors aged quickly in this work, their bodies breaking down under the constant physical strain. And tomorrow, he'll do it all again. Thomas performs his morning ablutions. Washes his face in cold water. Uses a cloth and some water to clean his teeth, a practice many of his contemporaries consider eccentric, even suspicious. But Thomas has noticed that the doctors who maintain better hygiene seem to survive longer. Correlation isn't causation, but when your life depends on small margins, you pay attention to patterns. Breakfast is the same as yesterday. The same as tomorrow will be. Bread, a bit of hard cheese, watered wine. The monotony of the diet is wearing, but it's reliable, which matters more than variety when you're living through a plague. As he eats, Thomas thinks about the day ahead. He'll need to revisit the Mercier household. The widow's body should have been collected by now, so that's one task completed. The baker's shop needs a follow-up inspection. And the Levi family in the Jewish quarter, he promised he would return. There's also the possibility of new cases. There are always new cases. The list Philippe hands him each morning grows shorter or longer depending on the plague's mood, its invisible progression through the city's population. Thomas begins donning his costume. The routine is so familiar now that his hands move almost without thought. The waxed coat. The leather overcoat. The gloves. Each piece a layer of protection, or at least the illusion of protection, between himself and the disease. The mask goes on last, and with it, the transformation. Thomas the man becomes Thomas the plague doctor. The bird-headed figure that haunts the nightmares of Avignon's children. He steps outside into the gray morning light. The sky is overcast, threatening rain. Rain during plague time is considered both blessing and curse. It might wash away the corrupt air, or it might spread the contagion through the water. Medieval theories of disease were full of such contradictions. Thomas walks toward the registrar's office, his boots echoing on the damp cobblestones. The streets are nearly empty. A few brave souls are out, hurrying about their business, but they give him wide berth. He passes a public fountain and pauses. Someone has left flowers there, and a small wooden cross. Memorial offerings for the dead. This is common during plague time. Public spaces become impromptu shrines, covered with offerings, prayers carved into walls, desperate pleas for divine intervention. The city itself seems to be grieving, Thomas thinks. Not just the people, but the stones, the walls, the very air. There's a weight to plague-stricken cities, a heaviness that goes beyond the visible suffering. At the registrar's office, Philippe is waiting with today's list. He looks more tired than usual, his eyes red-rimmed. "Bad night?" Thomas asks, his voice muffled by the mask. Philippe nods. "My sister's husband. He took sick yesterday evening. She sent word." He pauses, swallowing hard. "I can't go to her. Can't risk bringing it back to my own family. So I just sit here, making lists, while my sister watches her husband die." This was one of the cruelest aspects of plague. It shattered social bonds, turned family members into potential threats, made simple acts of compassion dangerous. People died alone because their loved ones were too frightened to sit with them. Children were abandoned when their parents fell sick. The social fabric that held communities together simply tore. "I'm sorry," Thomas says, knowing how inadequate the words are. Philippe straightens, forcing himself back to business. 6 addresses today. The Mercier House for follow-up. 2 new cases on Rue de la République, both in the same building. A suspected case near the North Gate. The Levi family in the Jewish Quarter. And... he hesitates. There's a problem at the pest house. Thomas feels his stomach tighten. The pest house. Every plague doctor dreads the pest house. Pest houses were isolation hospitals, usually established on the outskirts of cities during major outbreaks. They were meant to quarantine the sick away from the healthy population, concentrating the ill in one place where they could be managed. The theory was sound. The reality was nightmare. Pest houses were essentially death houses. Once you entered, you rarely left alive. The facilities were overcrowded, understaffed, and undersupplied. Patients lay on straw pallets, sometimes 2 or 3 to a bed. The smell was indescribable. The sounds of suffering constant. Staff were usually criminals or desperate poor, offered pardons or payment to work there. Many of them simply stole from the dying and provided minimal care. "What kind of problem?" Thomas asks. "Riot. Some of the patients tried to escape last night. Broke down a door. The guards killed 2 of them, but 3 got away. The city wants you to track them down, bring them back or certify them if they've already died somewhere." This was another grim duty of plague doctors, tracking down quarantine breakers. People who fled pest houses or broke sealed quarantines had to be found. They were walking sources of contagion, potentially spreading the plague wherever they went. Finding them was necessary. But it was also hunting human beings like animals, and Thomas hated it. "I'll handle it," he says, because what else can he say? Philippe hands him the list. Their fingers don't touch during the transfer. They never do. Thomas begins his rounds with the Mercier household. When he arrives, he sees that the red cross on the door has been joined by another mark, a black X. This means death has been certified here. The widow's body was collected, and Thomas's report from yesterday has been processed. He knocks anyway. 3 times. The official knock. No one answers. He knocks again, louder. Finally, a weak voice from inside. Go away. We're dying. What more do you want? I need to check on the family. City regulations. A long pause. Then shuffling footsteps. The door opens a crack, revealing in Mercier. She looks worse than yesterday. Much worse. Her eyes are glassy with fever. Her skin has taken on a grayish pallor. She's sick now too, clearly, though she's still on her feet. My husband died in the night, she says flatly. My son died this morning. I'll be next, I suppose. Then you can mark another black X on our door and be done with us. Thomas feels the weight of her words, the exhausted resignation. She's already given up. Already accepted death. There's nothing he can say that will change this. I need to verify, he says gently. She opens the door wider, gesturing him inside with a bitter laugh. Verify away, doctor. Count our corpses. Add us to your lists. Thomas enters. The smell hits him immediately, even through his mask's aromatic filters. The sweet rot smell of death, now multiplied. In the upstairs bedroom, he finds both bodies. The husband, cold and stiff, dead for hours. The son, still slightly warm, dead perhaps an hour or 2 ago. Both show the characteristic signs. The buboes. The blackened fingers where blood has pooled. The purple spots that mark hemorrhaging under the skin. He returns downstairs. And is sitting at the table, staring at nothing. Your daughter, Thomas says. Was she taken? Yesterday. The corpse collectors came after you left. Just took her. Threw her in a cart with 6 other bodies. My little girl. In a cart. Her voice breaks on the last word. This was one of the horrors of plague death. The loss of normal burial practices. No preparation of the body. No wake. No funeral procession. No individual grave with a marker. Just bodies stacked in carts, dumped in mass graves, covered with lime. For medieval people, who believed in the resurrection of the body, who put enormous importance on proper burial rites, this was a spiritual catastrophe as well as an emotional one. You didn't just lose your loved ones. You lost the ability to honor them, to see them properly into the afterlife. I'll note your husband and son in my report, Thomas says. The collectors will come again tonight. And me? And asks. How long do I have? It's a question Thomas hears often. People want to know. Want to prepare. Want some control over the one thing they can't control. Perhaps a day. Perhaps 2. Sometimes it's quick. She nods, as if he's confirmed something she already knew. I suppose that's a mercy. I don't want to linger. Don't want to be alone in this house with their bodies for days. Plague doctors walked a difficult line in these moments. They weren't supposed to offer false hope, but they also weren't supposed to cause despair. Their job was to document, to remain neutral, to be scientific observers. But they were also human beings, witnessing unbearable suffering, and the pretense of neutrality sometimes felt like cruelty. "Is there anyone I can notify?" Thomas asks. "Family elsewhere? Friends?" And shakes her head. "They're all dead or fled. We have no one." She looks up at him, meeting the blank glass eyes of his mask. "What's it like? Being the plague doctor? Walking through all this death, day after day? Doesn't it break you?" It's a shockingly intimate question. People rarely ask Thomas about himself, about his experience. He's supposed to be a functionary, a tool, not a person with feelings. Sometimes, he admits. But the work must be done. Why? Why must it be done? What difference do your lists make? Will counting our deaths bring us back? Thomas has asked himself this same question many times. What is the point of all this documentation? Does it help anyone? Does it matter? Perhaps someday, he says slowly, someone will read these records. We'll learn from them. We'll understand the plague better than we do now. And perhaps that understanding will save lives. Future lives, if not present ones. It's the hope he clings to. The meaning he's constructed for this meaningless work. That somewhere, in some future he won't live to see, this documentation will matter. And considers this. Then she nods. "Then write us down well, doctor. Make sure our names are spelled correctly. My husband was Pierre Mercier, counselor of Avignon. My son was Jacques, age 15, who wanted to be a scholar. My daughter was Marguerite, age 12, who loved birds. And I am in, who loved them all." Thomas commits this to memory. Not just the bare facts, but the details. The specificity. The humanity. "I'll remember," he promises. He leaves her there, sitting at her table, waiting for death. There's nothing more he can do. No comfort he can offer. No treatment that will help. Just the promise that she'll be remembered. That her family will be more than statistics in a ledger. It's not much. But sometimes, it's everything. Thomas steps back into the street. The overcast sky has darkened. Rain is coming. He pulls his coat tighter and continues to his next address. The boring daily life of a plague doctor. Walking from death to death. Writing down names. Bearing witness to endings. And somehow, despite everything, continuing. The rain begins as Thomas walks toward Rue de la République. Just a light drizzle at first, then heavier, turning the dusty streets to mud. Water runs down the curved beak of his mask, dripping from the tip like tears. The rain makes his work harder. The leather coat becomes heavier, waterlogged, pulling at his shoulders. His boots sink into the mud with each step. The glass lenses of his mask fog slightly, reducing his already limited vision. But there's no stopping. No calling off a day's work because of weather. The plague doesn't pause for rain, and neither can the plague doctor. He reaches the building on Rue de la République. It's a tenement, a multi-story structure divided into small rooms, each occupied by a different family. These buildings were common in medieval cities, cramped vertical housing for the working poor. And they were plague factories. When disease entered a tenement, it spread rapidly. Families living in close quarters, sharing walls, sharing staircases, sharing the communal cesspit in the courtyard. One sick person could infect an entire building within days. Thomas enters through the narrow doorway. The interior is dark and smells of too many people living in too little space. Cooking smells, chamber pots, unwashed bodies, damp wood. And underneath it all, now, the smell of sickness. According to Philippe's list, the 2 cases are on the 2nd floor. Thomas climbs the narrow wooden stairs, which creak ominously under his weight. The stairs are slick with moisture and grime. One misstep could send him tumbling. He reaches the 2nd floor landing. There are 4 doors here, all closed. He knocks on the first one indicated on his mental list. A man opens it almost immediately. He's young, perhaps 25, with a lean, hungry look. A laborer of some kind, judging by his calloused hands and rough clothing. "You're here for next door," he says before Thomas can speak. They're both sick. The whole floor knows it. "We're all just waiting to see who's next." "What about you?" Thomas asks. "Any symptoms?" The man shakes his head. "Not yet. But I'm not stupid. It's coming. Everyone in this building, we're all going to get it. It's just a matter of time." He says this matter-of-factly, without particular emotion. Thomas has noticed this phenomenon before. When plague struck densely packed neighborhoods, people often developed a kind of fatalistic calm. Fear eventually exhausted itself, and what replaced it was grim acceptance. Thomas moves to the next door and knocks. No answer. He knocks again, louder. Still nothing. "They might be dead already," the first man offers. "Haven't heard anything from there since last night." Thomas tries the door. It's not locked. Few people locked their doors in tenements, where privacy was minimal and everyone knew everyone else's business. He pushes it open. The room is tiny. Perhaps 10 feet by 12 feet. A single small window, shuttered against the rain. One bed, one table, one chair. 2 people live here, or lived here. A woman lies on the bed, her breathing shallow and rapid. She's perhaps 50, though poverty ages people quickly, so she could be younger. Her fever is evident even from across the room, sweat soaking the thin blanket covering her. A man lies on the floor beside the bed. He's not moving. Thomas approaches and checks with his cane. Cold. Dead. Probably been dead for hours. The buboes on both of them are unmistakable. Plague. Advanced stage. Thomas examines the woman more closely. She's unconscious or semi-conscious, her eyes half open but unseeing. Her lips are cracked and bleeding. She's desperately dehydrated. This was common in plague's final stages. The fever burned so hot that patients couldn't retain water. They died not just from the disease itself but from the complications, dehydration, secondary infections, organ failure. In a hospital, with modern understanding, some plague patients could be saved. But in 1630, in a one-room tenement in Avignon, with no treatment beyond prayer, there's nothing to be done. The woman won't last the night. Probably won't last another few hours. Thomas backs out of the room. The young man is still standing in his doorway, watching. Both dead? He asks. One dead. One dying. The man nods. I knew them. Marcel and Catherine Du Bois. They were weavers. Good people. Quiet. Kept to themselves. He pauses. Should I get a priest? It's a good question. The dying were supposed to receive last rites, confession, communion, extreme unction. The ritual that prepared the soul for death. But priests were scarce during plague time, and many were reluctant to enter infected buildings. You can try, Thomas says. But I wouldn't count on one coming. This was one of the quiet tragedies of the plague. The breakdown of religious support at precisely the moment people needed it most. The Church, which claimed authority over death and dying, which promised to guide souls to salvation, often simply absent when the dying needed it. Some plague priests did their duty, entering infected homes, administering last rites to hundreds of victims before succumbing themselves. These men were genuinely heroic. But they were also relatively rare. Most clergy, like most people, chose self-preservation over duty. Thomas makes his mental notes. 2 victims, same room, weavers, advanced plague. 1 dead, 1 dying. Building quarantine recommended, though enforcement in tenements was nearly impossible. The building will need to be sealed, Thomas tells the young man. No one in or out. The man's face darkens. Sealed? You're condemning us all to death, then. I'm following city regulations. Your regulations will kill us just as surely as the plague. We need to work. Need to buy food. If you seal this building, we'll starve even if we don't get sick. He's right, of course. Quarantine regulations were necessary to slow the plague's spread, but they created impossible situations. People trapped in sealed buildings often did starve, or died of other treatable conditions because they couldn't seek help. The tension between public health measures and individual survival was constant during plague outbreaks. And plague doctors, as enforcers of quarantine, were often caught in the middle. Hated by those they were trying to protect. I'll note your concerns in my report, Thomas says, knowing how hollow this sounds. Your report, the man spits. What good is your report? Will it feed my children? Will it pay my rent? Thomas has no answer. He turns and descends the stairs, leaving the young man's anger hanging in the narrow hallway. Outside, the rain is falling harder now. Thomas stands in the courtyard of the tenement, water streaming off his costume, and feels the weight of futility. What is he accomplishing? What good is any of this? He documents death but cannot prevent it. He enforces quarantines that cause suffering. He walks through the city as a symbol of authority but has no real power to help anyone. Medieval plague doctors occupied a strange position in society. They were given significant authority, the power to enter any home, to declare quarantines, to certify deaths. But they had almost no ability to actually heal or help. Their authority was purely administrative, bureaucratic. They were managers of death, not healers of life. And this disconnect, between the appearance of medical authority and the reality of helplessness, created a profound sense of purposelessness in many plague doctors. Some dealt with this through drinking. Some through adopting a cynical, detached attitude. Some simply broke under the psychological weight. Thomas deals with it by focusing on the work, on the documentation, on the small rituals of his routine. He tells himself that what he's doing matters, even when he can't see how. He needs to move on. The suspected case near the North Gate. Then the Levi family. then the grim task of tracking down the escaped pest house patients. But for just a moment, he stands in the rain, letting the water wash over him, wishing it could wash away more than just dirt. A voice calls out from above. Thomas looks up to see an old woman leaning out of a third-floor window. "Doctor! Doctor, please! My grandson is sick. Not on the list. Not officially reported. But does that matter?" Thomas hesitates. He's supposed to follow the official addresses Philippe gave him. Going to unreported cases complicates things, creates more work, potentially exposes him to additional risk. But he's here. The child is sick. And isn't this why he took this position in the first place? To help, in whatever limited way he can. "I'm coming," he calls back. The old woman's face shows relief, then disappears from the window. Thomas re-enters the building and climbs to the third floor. The old woman is waiting at her door, wringing her hands. "Thank you, doctor. Thank you. Please, he's just a child. Only 8 years old. Please, you have to help him." She leads him into a room much like the one below, small, cramped, but somehow kept cleaner. A boy lies on a pallet in the corner, curled on his side, shivering despite being covered in blankets. Thomas examines him. Fever, yes. Chills. But no buboes that he can see. No obvious signs of plague. "When did he fall ill?" Thomas asks. "This morning. He woke up feeling cold, said his stomach hurt. I thought maybe he'd eaten something bad. But then the fever came on so quick." Thomas checks the boy's abdomen carefully with his cane, prodding gently. The child winces and cries out. Tenderness in the lower right side. This might not be plague at all. It could be any number of other ailments. Appendicitis, perhaps, though medieval medicine didn't understand the appendix. An intestinal blockage. Food poisoning. Any of dozens of conditions that a modern doctor could diagnose. But in 1630, without modern diagnostic tools, everything looked like plague. Every fever, every pain, every unexplained illness, people assumed the worst. "I don't think it's plague," Thomas says carefully. "But keep him warm. Give him water if he'll take it. Watch for swelling in the neck, armpits, or groin. If you see that, report it immediately." The old woman's relief is visible. "Not plague? You're sure?" "I can't be certain. But the signs aren't consistent with what I usually see." This is as close to hope as Thomas can offer. And he sees what it does to her, how her whole body relaxes, how tears spring to her eyes. "Thank you," she whispers. "Thank you. God bless you, doctor." Thomas nods and leaves. He's only told her the truth, but to her, he's offered salvation. These moments, these rare instances where he can provide reassurance rather than confirm fears, these are what keep Thomas going. The boy might still die. Might develop plague tomorrow. Might succumb to whatever other illness is affecting him. But today, Thomas gave his grandmother hope. And sometimes, that's enough. He exits the tenement into the still falling rain. His feet are soaked. His coat is heavy with water. His body aches from the climbing and bending and walking. But he continues. Because the work isn't finished. Because there are more addresses on his list. Because this is what he does. The boring, exhausting, occasionally meaningful daily life of a plague doctor. One address at a time. One patient at a time. One day at a time. The rain has settled into a steady downpour by the time Thomas reaches the north gate. Water streams through the streets, carrying refuse and filth toward the drains, turning the city into a maze of flowing muck. His boots are caked with mud, adding extra weight to every step. The suspected case is in a guard tower built into the city wall. Someone at the garrison has fallen ill, and the captain wants it checked before it spreads through the barracks. Military cases always receive priority. The city depends on guards to maintain order, to enforce quarantines, to keep the desperate from rioting. If plague swept through the garrison, authority itself might collapse. Thomas climbs the stone steps to the guard tower. A soldier stops him at the entrance, hand on his sword hilt, though he keeps his distance. "State your business." "Plague doctor." Called to examine a sick guard. The soldier's face tightens. He doesn't want Thomas here. No one wants the plague doctor in their workspace, in their home, anywhere near them. Because where the plague doctor goes, death follows. Or at least, that's how it seems. Third floor. Corporal Matthew. He's been isolated. The guard steps aside, pressing himself against the wall to maximize the distance between them. Thomas climbs more stairs. His legs burn. He's climbed so many stairs today. Tenements, towers, every building seems to be multiple stories, and the sick are always on the upper floors. Medieval cities built upward out of necessity. Land within city walls was expensive, limited. So buildings grew tall and narrow, staircases steep and cramped. For plague doctors carrying heavy protective gear, moving through these vertical cities was exhausting. The third floor is a single large room used as a barracks. Bunks line the walls. Most are empty, the other guards have been moved elsewhere to avoid contagion. In the far corner, isolated from the rest, one bunk is occupied. A man lies there, wrapped in blankets despite the warmth of the day. Thomas can hear his labored breathing from across the room. As Thomas approaches, he notices something that makes him pause. This room is cleaner than most he's visited. The floor is swept. The air, while close, doesn't have the overwhelming stench of unwashed bodies and waste that characterizes most plague rooms. Military discipline extended even to hygiene. Soldiers were required to maintain their quarters, to wash regularly, to dispose of waste properly. These practices, done for morale and practical military reasons, actually helped reduce disease transmission. This is why military units sometimes had lower infection rates than the general population, despite living in close quarters. Not because soldiers were healthier or stronger, but because military organization imposed hygiene standards that civilians didn't follow. Thomas reaches the sick man's bunk. Corporal Matthew is perhaps 30, with the weathered look of a career soldier. His face is flushed with fever, and he's shivering violently. "Corporal," Thomas says, "I need to examine you." The man's eyes open. They're glassy, unfocused. Are you deaf?" he mumbles. "No. Just a doctor." "You look like death." The bird face. "I've seen death before. On the battlefield." "He doesn't look like that. He looks like nothing. Like absence. Fever delirium." Thomas has heard countless variations of fever ramblings. Some see angels. Some see demons. Some see nothing at all, lost in their own confused thoughts. He uses his cane to pull back the blanket and lift the man's shirt. There, in the armpit. Buboes. Not as advanced as some Thomas has seen, but unmistakable. Plague. In the garrison. Exactly what the captain feared. Thomas covers the man again. How long have you been symptomatic? Yesterday. Maybe. Time is strange. Everything is strange. Am I dying, doctor? It's the question Thomas hears constantly. And he still doesn't know how to answer it. Sometimes he lies and offers false comfort. Sometimes he tells the truth. Today, he's too tired for lies. Perhaps. But some survive. You're young, strong. You have a chance. This is true, if not encouraging. Plague mortality rates varied widely, but generally somewhere between 30 and 60% of infected people died. Which meant that 40 to 70% survived. Those odds weren't good, but they weren't hopeless either. Survival seemed to depend on many factors. Age, general health, the specific strain of plague, how quickly it progressed, sheer luck. Medieval people didn't understand the mechanisms, but they observed the patterns. Some people survived. Others didn't. There was no clear logic to it. A chance, Matthew repeats. I'll take a chance. Better than no chance at all. Thomas admires his spirit. Soldiers often faced plague better than civilians. They were used to confronting death, used to operating under stress, used to following orders even when afraid. Not that it helped them survive more often, but it helped them face dying with more equanimity. I'll report to your captain, Thomas says. You'll be kept isolated here. Someone will bring food and water. Stay in bed. Don't try to move around. Isolated, Matthew laughs, a bitter sound. That's a kind word for abandoned. He's not entirely wrong. Isolation during plague was meant to protect others, but it also meant dying alone if you were going to die. No comrades beside you. No priest to offer last rites. Just solitude and suffering. Thomas descends the tower stairs and finds the captain waiting below. He's a grizzled man in his 50s, with scars mapping his face and a bearing that suggests he's survived worse things than plague. Well, the captain asks, his voice clipped, military. Plague. Early stage. He'll need to remain isolated. Any guards who were in close contact with him should be watched for symptoms. The captain's jaw tightens. How many guards? How many shared that barracks room? 12. Plus Matthew makes 13. Unlucky number, though Thomas doesn't point this out. They should all be isolated from the rest of the garrison. Separate quarters if possible. If any develop fever or swelling, they need immediate isolation. That leaves me with barely enough men to patrol the walls and gates. The city is already tense. If word gets out that the garrison is infected. He doesn't finish the sentence. He doesn't need to. Thomas understands the implications. Fear could turn into panic. Panic into riot. And without guards to maintain order. Medieval cities during plague outbreaks were powder kegs. Authority was fragile. Food was scarce. Death was everywhere. All it took was one spark, a rumor, a shortage, a perceived injustice, and the whole structure could explode into violence. Some cities did experience plague riots. Mobs attacking doctors, burning the houses of the wealthy, breaking into granaries to steal food, massacring scapegoated groups. Authorities struggled to maintain control when the fundamental social contract, protection in exchange for obedience, seemed to have broken down. I'll note in my report that the garrison situation is under control, Thomas offers. That you're managing the case appropriately. It's a small kindness, but the captain recognizes it. His expression softens slightly. Thank you, Doctor. I know you're just doing your job. Same as me. They're both cogs in the machinery of plague management, Thomas thinks. The captain enforcing quarantines and order. Thomas documenting deaths and certifying cases. Neither of them with real power to change outcomes, just trying to keep the structure from collapsing entirely. Thomas leaves the tower and stands in the rain for a moment, considering. He still needs to visit the Levi family in the Jewish quarter. And then the grim task of tracking down the escaped pest house patients. The day is wearing on. The rain shows no signs of stopping. And Thomas is so tired. Bone tired. Soul tired. But the work continues. It always continues. He begins walking toward the Jewish quarter, following the now familiar route. The streets are nearly empty in the heavy rain. Those who must be out hurry from shelter to shelter, heads down, miserable. Thomas passes a group of friars distributing bread to the poor. Charitable work continued during plague time, though charity workers died in large numbers from their close contact with the desperate and sick. These particular friars are young, probably new to their order, assigned to plague duty as a test of their faith. One of them looks up as Thomas passes, meeting his masked gaze. The friar's face shows fear, yes, but also something else. Recognition, perhaps. Two men doing difficult work for little reward, bound by duty rather than desire. The friar makes the sign of the cross in Thomas's direction. Blessing or warding, Thomas isn't sure. Maybe both. He continues to the Jewish quarter. The rain seems heavier here, or perhaps he's just more aware of it. Water runs down the narrow streets in streams, gurgling through ancient drains that probably date back to Roman times. The quarter is quiet. More shuttered windows than usual. People staying inside, protecting themselves not just from plague but from the scrutiny of Christian neighbors who might use the outbreak as excuse for violence. Thomas walks to the Levi house and knocks. 3 times. The official knock. The door opens immediately. Rachel Levi stands there, her face worn with exhaustion and grief. She doesn't need to speak. Thomas can see the answer in her eyes. He died, she says simply. This morning. Just before dawn. He was calling for his mother at the end. Like a child. Thomas enters. The house is dimmer than yesterday, all the candles extinguished except one. A mourning custom, perhaps, though Thomas isn't familiar with Jewish practices. Abraham Levi lies on the bed upstairs, covered with a clean white sheet. Someone has closed his eyes and composed his hands. Despite the plague marks on his body, there's a dignity to his arrangement. Someone loved this man, cared for him, honored him in death. You prepared him yourself? Thomas asks Rachel. She nods. I know I wasn't supposed to touch him. I know the risk. But he's my husband. Was my husband. I couldn't let him lie there, uncomposed. Undignified. This is what plague regulations often didn't account for. The human need to care for the dead, to perform final rituals, to honor relationships that didn't end simply because the body stopped breathing. Have you developed any symptoms? Thomas asks. Not yet. But I will, won't I? I slept beside him, nursed him, prepared his body. I'm certainly infected. She says this calmly, without particular fear. Just acceptance. She's already decided she'll die, already mourning her own life along with her husband's. Perhaps. Perhaps not. Some people don't contract it even with close exposure. The disease is unpredictable. God's will, you mean? If you like. Thomas doesn't believe in God's will anymore, if he ever did. He's seen too much randomness, too much senseless suffering. But he won't argue theology with a grieving widow. The community will want to bury him, Rachel says. According to our traditions. Before sunset. Can you allow this? This is complicated. Jewish law required rapid burial, ideally within 24 hours. But plague regulations often mandated that bodies be held for the corpse collectors, disposed of in mass graves to reduce contagion risk. Thomas has some discretion here. He could certify the death and note that the body should be released to the family for burial. It might cause problems with his superiors, but it's within his authority. I'll certify that he can be released to your community for burial, Thomas says. But you understand the quarantine must continue for you. 14 days from today. 14 days was the standard plague quarantine period. Based on observation that people who would get sick usually showed symptoms within 2 weeks. The number was somewhat arbitrary, and often ignored or imperfectly enforced, but it was the official requirement. 14 days alone in this house, Rachel says. With his absence. His silence. 14 days to wait and see if I'll join him. I'm sorry. Everyone is sorry. But sorry doesn't bring him back. Sorry doesn't protect me. Sorry is just a word. She's right. Apologies are inadequate. Sympathy is inadequate. Everything Thomas can offer is inadequate. He makes his mental notes. Abraham Levi, deceased, bubonic plague, Jewish quarter. Body released for religious burial. Wife quarantined. As he prepares to leave, Rachel speaks again. You kept your word. You came back. Like you promised. Yes. Thank you. For that, at least. For keeping your word. It's such a small thing. Just showing up. Just doing what he said he would do. But in a time when social bonds are breaking, when promises are abandoned, when fear drives people to betray their commitments, maybe small things matter more. Thomas leaves the Levi house. The rain continues. One more task remains. The escaped pest house patients. The worst task. The one he's been dreading all day. But it must be done. Because the work never stops. The plague never rests. And Thomas continues. The pest house sits outside the city walls, deliberately isolated from the healthy population. Thomas walks through the north gate, past guards who turn their faces away, past the last houses of the city proper, into the space between the walls and the surrounding countryside. This liminal zone is where cities put their unwanted things. Garbage dumps. tanneries with their terrible smells, slaughterhouses, leper colonies, and during plague time, pest houses. The building itself was once a monastery. The monks fled or died years ago, and the city repurposed it. The irony isn't lost on Thomas. A place meant for spiritual healing now serves as a warehouse for the dying. As he approaches, he can hear it. The sound of the pest house. Moaning. Crying. Screaming sometimes. The sounds of dozens of people suffering together, their individual miseries blending into one continuous noise of anguish. Pest houses in plague-stricken cities were nightmarish places. They were meant to isolate the infectious, to protect the healthy population by concentrating the sick in one location. But they became overcrowded almost immediately, with patients crammed together, sometimes multiple people sharing a single bed or pallet. Staff were nearly impossible to find. Most pest house workers were criminals offered pardons in exchange for service, or desperately poor people with no other options. Many were corrupt, stealing from patients, providing minimal care, sometimes even hastening deaths to loot bodies more quickly. Mortality rates in pest houses approached 90%. Once you entered, you almost never left alive. Everyone knew this, which is why people fought so hard to avoid being sent there, why families hid sick relatives, why riots sometimes broke out when authorities tried to force plague victims into pest houses. Thomas reaches the main entrance. A guard sits on a stool outside, looking miserable in the rain. His face is wrapped in cloth soaked in vinegar, a common protective measure that did nothing to prevent plague but at least masked some of the smell. "Doctor," the guard acknowledges, not rising. "You hear about the runners?" "Yes. 3 escaped last night, I was told." The guard spits. "Damned idiots. Broke through a window on the east side. Killed 2 of them right there, but 3 got away into the darkness. Been tracking them all morning, but the rain washed away most traces." "Did you find them?" "One of them. Dead in a ditch about half a mile from here. Collapsed while running, looks like." "The other 2? He shrugs. "Could be anywhere. Could have made it back into the city before we closed the gates. Could be hiding in the countryside. Could be dead in some field where we haven't looked yet." This is what Thomas feared. Escaped plague patients were a serious threat. They could spread the disease to new areas, could infect people who had so far been spared. Finding them was essential, but also difficult and dangerous. "Show me the one you found," Thomas says. The guard leads him along a muddy path to where the body has been laid out under a crude shelter, just some canvas stretched between poles. The corpse is that of a young man, perhaps 20, rail-thin, marked by the characteristic plague buboes. Thomas examines the body perfunctorily. Dead, clearly. Plague, obviously. But he needs to make an official certification for the records. "Any identification?" Thomas asks. "Nothing. Could be anyone. We don't exactly keep detailed records in there." The guard gestures toward the pest house. "People come in, most die, we dump them in the pit. Names don't matter much." This was one of the casualties of plague, the loss of individual identity among the mass of dead. In normal times, even the poorest person got a burial with some marker, some acknowledgement of their existence. During plague, you became just another body in a pit. Medieval society was highly stratified, with elaborate hierarchies of status and rank. But plague was a great equalizer in death. Rich and poor, noble and peasant, all ended up in the same mass graves, indistinguishable in their decay. "I'll certify this one," Thomas says. "The other two? I'll need to search for them." The guard looks at him with something like pity. "In this rain? Doctor, they could be anywhere. You'll be walking in circles until dark and find nothing." Nevertheless, Thomas understands the futility of this task. Two sick people in the vast countryside surrounding Avignon, possibly hiding, possibly already dead in some concealed location. The chances of finding them are minimal. But the attempt must be made. The documentation must show that proper procedures were followed. That the city's plague doctor did his duty, even when that duty was pointless. He begins walking, following the rough direction the guard indicates the escapees might have fled. The rain makes everything harder. The ground is slippery. Visibility is poor. And Thomas is already exhausted from a full day of plague rounds. The countryside outside Avignon is a patchwork of small farms, vineyards, and wooded areas. Plenty of places for desperate people to hide. Thomas walks slowly, scanning for any signs: disturbed earth, torn cloth, tracks in the mud. After an hour of fruitless searching, he finds something. A scrap of fabric caught on a thorn bush. The cloth is coarse, the type worn by poor people. It could be from an escaped patient's clothing, or it could be from anyone who passed through here in the last month. But it's something. Thomas follows the rough direction the torn fabric suggests, moving deeper into a wooded area. The trees provide some shelter from the rain, but also make the terrain more treacherous. Roots to trip over. Low branches that catch on his costume. The bird mask limits his peripheral vision, making navigation difficult. He's beginning to think this is truly hopeless when he hears something. A cough. Weak and wet sounding, but definitely human. Thomas moves toward the sound, pushing through underbrush. And there, huddled under a fallen tree, he finds one of them. It's a woman, middle-aged, soaked through, shivering violently. She looks up as Thomas approaches, and her eyes go wide with terror at the sight of his bird mask. "No," she whispers. "No, please. Don't take me back. Please." Thomas stops a few paces away. "You're sick. You need shelter, care." "Care?" she laughs, a horrible sound. "There's no care in that place. It's just a pit where they throw us to die. I'd rather die here, under this tree, in the rain, than go back to that hell." Thomas has heard similar descriptions of pest houses from other patients. The overcrowding. The lack of food and water. The theft by staff. The absence of any actual medical care. Some patients compared pest houses to mass graves where you were buried alive. "You can't stay here," Thomas says gently. "You'll die of exposure before the plague kills you. Then I'll die. But I'll die free. Not locked in a room full of screaming, not lying in my own filth because no one will help me move, not." She breaks off, coughing again. Blood flecks her lips. Advanced plague, possibly complicated by pneumonia from exposure to the cold rain. Thomas feels the weight of impossible choices. His duty is to return her to the pest house, to quarantine her away from the healthy population. But doing so means condemning her to the exact suffering she's describing. Suffering she's willing to die in the mud to avoid. Medieval plague doctors had limited legal authority to make decisions like this. Officially, they were supposed to report cases, enforce quarantines, ensure compliance with regulations. But in practice, out here in the countryside with no one watching, Thomas has discretion. "If I leave you here," Thomas says slowly, "you'll die. Probably within hours. You understand this?" "Yes." "And you prefer that? To dying in the pest house?" "God, yes. I just want quiet. And sky. And to not be crushed in with all those bodies. Please." Thomas considers. By regulations, he should drag her back, or at minimum report her location so guards can retrieve her. But what purpose does that serve? She's dying either way. Why not let her die as she chooses? "I found you too late," Thomas says finally. "You were already dead when I got here." "That's what I'll report." Relief floods her face. "Thank you. Thank you. Do you want me to stay?" "Until..." She shakes her head. "No. I want to be alone. Please." Thomas nods. He removes his outer glove for a moment and reaches into his coat, pulling out a small flask. He's not supposed to share it, it's his own water ration. But he sets it beside her anyway. "In case you get thirsty," he says. Then he turns and walks away, leaving her under the tree, in the rain, dying on her own terms. It's a small mercy. Perhaps the only one he can offer. As he walks back toward the city, Thomas thinks about the cruelty of plague regulations. They're necessary, yes. They save lives overall by limiting transmission. But they also create such suffering. They take away dignity, choice, autonomy. They reduce people to problems to be managed, contained, disposed of. And plague doctors are the enforcers of this system. The agents of well-intentioned cruelty. Thomas carries this knowledge like a weight, growing heavier with each passing day. He reaches the pest house again. The guard is gone, probably retreated inside out of the rain. Thomas doesn't report the woman's location. He simply continues walking, back toward the city gate. The search for the third escapee will have to wait for another day. Or perhaps that person has already died somewhere, undiscovered. Perhaps they've made it far from Avignon, carrying plague to some unsuspecting village. Perhaps they've found a barn to shelter in and will recover against all odds. Thomas will never know. And he's learned to accept this. There are limits to what he can document, control, understand. Some stories end without witnesses. Some deaths go unrecorded. The rain is finally easing as Thomas re-enters the city. It's late afternoon now, approaching evening. He's been walking for hours, examining patients, certifying deaths, tracking escaped pest houses patients through the mud. His body aches everywhere. His feet are raw in his wet boots. His shoulders burn from the weight of the soaked leather coat. The mask feels like it's crushing his skull. But the day isn't over yet. He still needs to return to the registrar's office, give Philippe his verbal report. Then home to write everything in his ledger. To document all the death he's witnessed, all the suffering he's been unable to prevent. The boring, terrible, endless work of the plague doctor. Thomas walks through the darkening streets, the bird mask dripping, his boots squelching with each step. People see him and turn away. Children point and are hushed by their parents. A dog barks at him, sensing something wrong, something unnatural about this bird-headed figure. He's so tired. So deeply, thoroughly tired. Not just physically, though his body is exhausted, but mentally, spiritually. Tired of death. Tired of suffering. Tired of his own helplessness in the face of endless tragedy. But tomorrow, he'll wake up. He'll don the costume again. He'll walk through the city again, entering infected houses, examining sick patients, certifying deaths, documenting everything in his careful, meticulous handwriting. Because this is what he does. This is who he is now. The plague doctor of Avignon. The man in the bird mask. The recorder of death. And the work continues. Always continues. Until the plague ends. Or until he joins the countless dead he's already written into his ledger. Evening settles over Avignon as Thomas makes his way to the registrar's office. The rain has stopped, leaving the streets glistening and the air unusually clear. In the distance, church bells ring for Vespers, the evening prayer service that marks the day's transition toward night. The city at dusk has a strange quality during plague time. It's neither fully alive nor fully dead. A few people move about, hurrying to complete final errands before darkness makes the streets too dangerous. Shutters close. Doors are barred. The city seals itself against the night, against the corpse collectors who will soon begin their grim rounds. Thomas's shadow stretches long before him, the bird-headed silhouette elongated and distorted on the wet cobblestones. He looks monstrous, he knows. A creature from nightmares. Children will have bad dreams tonight about the birdman they saw walking through their streets. But tomorrow, those same children might need him. Might fall sick and require his documentation, his certification, his official acknowledgement of their suffering. The monster becomes necessary. Fear becomes familiarity. He reaches the registrar's office just as Philippe is preparing to close for the day. The clerk looks worse than this morning, his face drawn, his movements slow and deliberate, like someone moving through deep water. "Your sister's husband?" Thomas asks. Philippe nods. "Dead. She sent word an hour ago. And now she's showing symptoms herself. Fever. Chills." His voice is flat, emotionless. The tone of someone who's moved beyond feeling into simple endurance. "I'm sorry." "Yes. Everyone's sorry." Philippe echoes in Mercier's words from this morning. Sorry. The universal refrain of plague time. Sorry, but helpless. Sorry, but unable to change anything. Thomas gives his report. The Mercier household, 3 more deaths confirmed, wife dying. The widow collected. The tenement cases, 2 more for the records. The guard with plague in the garrison, 1 case, isolated. The Levite death in the Jewish quarter, certified, body released for burial. The escaped pest house patient, found deceased. He doesn't mention the woman he left under the tree. That death will go unrecorded. 1 small mercy buried in the day's accounting of tragedy. Philippe writes everything down mechanically, his pen scratching across the page. These reports go to the city council, who use them to track the plague's progress, to make decisions about quarantines and closures, to calculate how many corpse collectors they need, how many graves they need to dig. The bureaucracy of death is surprisingly complex. Medieval cities, for all their limitations, developed sophisticated administrative systems during plague outbreaks. They tracked cases, monitored neighborhoods, allocated resources, enforced regulations. It was early public health infrastructure, crude but functional. And at the center of this system sat men like Philippe, recording numbers, filing reports, transforming human tragedy into administrative data. And men like Thomas, gathering that data, walking among the dying so that others could make decisions from a safe distance. The council wants daily reports now, Philippe says, still writing. Instead of every 3 days. They think the plague is accelerating. Is it? Philippe looks up, meeting Thomas's glass-eyed gaze. You tell me. You're the one out there. Are we dying faster? Thomas considers. Is the plague accelerating? It's hard to say. Some days bring many cases. Other days bring few. The pattern seems random, though perhaps there's an underlying logic he can't perceive. I don't know, he admits. The numbers fluctuate. But the fear is definitely increasing. People are more desperate. More willing to break quarantine, to flee, to do desperate things. This was a common pattern in plague outbreaks. The disease would establish itself, then reach a point where social structures began to break down. Fear overwhelmed reason. Desperation drove people to actions they'd never normally consider. The fabric of society, already stressed by mortality, began to tear. Some cities descended into complete chaos during major outbreaks. Looting. Rioting. Mass graves left open because there weren't enough workers to cover them. Bodies piling up in streets because the corpse collectors themselves had died or fled. Authority collapsing entirely. Avignon hasn't reached that point yet. But Thomas can sense it approaching. The pressure building. The tension in people's faces. The way conversations stop when he approaches, as if his presence makes the unthinkable suddenly real. Daily reports then, Thomas says. I'll come by every evening. Philippe nods and closes his ledger. For a moment, they simply stand there, two exhausted men at the end of a long day, both carrying knowledge they wish they didn't have. Do you ever wonder, Philippe says quietly, if we'll be remembered? Years from now, will anyone know what we did here? Will they understand what it cost? Thomas thinks about his ledgers. The careful records. The names written in his precise handwriting. Will anyone ever read them? Will anyone care? Perhaps, he says. Or perhaps we'll just be a footnote. A number. The plague of 1630 killed X thousand people in Avignon. No names. No stories. Just a statistic. That's a grim thought. Most thoughts are grim these days. Philippe manages a weak smile. Tomorrow then, doctor. Same time. Tomorrow. Thomas leaves and begins the final walk back to his isolated house. The streets are nearly empty now. Only the corpse collectors are out, their carts creaking, their lanterns swinging. Thomas steps aside as one passes, and the collectors avert their eyes. Even they, who handle the dead directly, are wary of the plague doctor. The hierarchy of plague work was peculiar. Doctors like Thomas had official status, authority, relatively good pay. But they were also considered tainted, contaminated by their constant exposure. Corpse collectors, meanwhile, had the most dangerous work, direct contact with infectious bodies, but were considered the lowest social class, barely human. Everyone involved in plague work carried a stigma. You were necessary but unwanted. Essential but contaminated. Even after the plague ended, many plague workers found themselves socially isolated, unable to return to normal life because people couldn't forget what they'd done, where they'd been. Thomas reaches his house and begins the careful process of removing his costume. Gloves first. Outer coat. Inner coat. Finally the mask. He looks at his reflection in the small metal mirror. His face is pale, thinner than it was 3 months ago. Dark circles under his eyes. A hollowness to his cheeks. The work is consuming him, bit by bit. But he's still alive. Still healthy. Still functioning. That's more than many plague doctors can say. He washes thoroughly, scrubbing his hands and face with vinegar water. Then he sits at his table and opens his ledger to record the day's entries. The act of writing is soothing, as always. Bringing order to chaos. Giving structure to suffering. Making permanent what would otherwise be forgotten. Medieval record-keeping during plague outbreaks varied widely in quality. Some cities kept meticulous records that survived for centuries. Others kept almost nothing, leaving historians to estimate death tolls from fragmentary evidence. Thomas's ledgers, though he doesn't know it, will eventually be archived and preserved. Centuries later, historians will read them, will piece together the story of plague in Avignon, will know the names he's recording. N. Mercier. Abraham Levi. Corporal Matthew. The baker's apprentice. The widow on Rue Saint-Michel. All of them preserved in ink, given a kind of immortality through documentation. Thomas writes until his hand cramps. Then he closes the ledger and prepares his evening meal. Tonight there's a surprise. Someone, probably the boy who delivers his food rations, has left extra bread and a small wedge of cheese. Better cheese than usual, almost good quality. In a note, written in crude letters, "Thank you, doctor." Thomas doesn't know who left this. Doesn't know which family he helped, which death he certified, which act of his was being acknowledged. But someone, somewhere, appreciated his work. Saw him as more than just the bird-masked harbinger of death. It's a small thing. A tiny gesture. But it moves him more than he'd expected. His eyes sting with unexpected tears. He eats the bread and cheese slowly, savoring them. They taste better than anything he's eaten in weeks. Not because of their quality, but because of what they represent. Recognition. Gratitude. A reminder that he's still human, still connected to the community he serves. After eating, Thomas sits by his window and looks out at the city. Lights flicker in windows. Somewhere, a baby is crying. Somewhere, life continues despite death's presence. Plague doctors typically served contracts of 3 to 6 months, with renewal optional. Thomas's initial 3-month contract is nearly complete. Soon he'll need to decide whether to continue or to leave, to find some other life, some other work. Many plague doctors chose not to renew. The psychological toll, the physical exhaustion, the constant exposure to death, it was too much. They'd take their accumulated pay and go somewhere else, try to rebuild some semblance of normal existence. But where would Thomas go? What would he do? He spent 3 months as a plague doctor. That experience has changed him in ways he can't fully articulate. He's seen things no one should see. knows things no one should know. How do you return to normal life after that? And there's something else. A sense of purpose, however grim. A feeling that what he's doing matters, even if he can't always see how. The woman under the tree. And Mercier, who wanted her family remembered. Rachel Levi, grateful that he kept his word. The grandmother with the sick child, relieved by his reassurance. These moments matter. These small acts of witnessing, of documentation, of mercy. They don't save lives, but they preserve dignity. They acknowledge suffering. They say, you existed, you mattered, your death will be recorded. Thomas decides, sitting there in the gathering darkness, that he'll renew his contract. He'll continue for another 3 months. Or until the plague ends. Or until he dies. Whichever comes first. It's not a heroic decision. Not really. It's just the choice that feels right. Or perhaps the choice that feels least wrong. He stands and prepares for bed. His body aches as he lies down, every muscle protesting the day's exertions. But it's a familiar ache now. Almost comfortable in its consistency. Outside, the city settles into nighttime quiet. The corpse collectors finish their rounds. The few remaining lights wink out. Darkness covers Avignon like a blanket. And Thomas drifts towards sleep, knowing that tomorrow will bring more death, more suffering, more entries in his ledger. But also knowing that he'll rise, don his costume, and continue the work. Because someone has to do it. Someone has to walk among the dying. Someone has to write down the names. And that someone, for now, is him. The boring daily life of a medieval plague doctor. Repetitive. Exhausting. Necessary. A life measured in addresses visited, deaths certified, names recorded. A life that no one would envy, that few would choose, but that someone must live. And Thomas will continue living it. One day at a time. One death at a time. One careful entry in his ledger at a time. Until the plague ends. Or until his name joins the thousands he's already recorded. But not tonight. Tonight, he sleeps. And tomorrow he'll begin again. The work continues. The plague continues. And the man in the bird mask continues. Walking. Documenting. Witnessing. Boring. Necessary. Unending. And so concludes the daily life of Thomas, plague doctor of Avignon. A life of quiet suffering, endless documentation, and small mercies in the face of overwhelming tragedy. May these hours have brought you peace, knowledge, and restful sleep. Good night.